Guys, here's what haunts me. So I think about Judgment Day, and I think of many people who will say, as they are being facing the judgment and being taken to hell, you never warned me. They'll say, you never told me there was a place called hell, that this was what was at stake.
I think, I say this carefully, but I think at times we may have got evangelism wrong, our understanding of evangelism wrong. We've professionalized evangelism. We expect everyone to evangelize as an evangelist. Now, you, brother, are an evangelist, and I am so profoundly grateful to God for you. But not everyone is an evangelist. And it strikes me from what the scriptures teach us, Colossians 4:6 and 1 Peter 3, that we're to live deliciously distinctive lives and be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us. So in other words, there is going to be a lifestyle wherever we are, work, community, we're just going to be living under the lordship of Christ. And that should be far more radical than I think it is at the moment. And we should be expecting that God sovereignly is going to give us opportunities to speak for him. You know, why do you tick like that? How have you coped with that grief situation? What do you think about this? And a lot of our people have ducked out of evangelism because the cost is too high, or they see it as let's get them into the building. Now, the building has a place. I'm not knocking that for one. I think there is some value in attractional gatherings, but I think those things they give us the macro story. They put the story together, whereas what we need are the people who are doing the micro story. This is Jesus and me. This is why I'm living as I do. And that, therefore, involves every single person. You see, to some people, evangelism is now an optional extra in their Christian life. And it's what the evangelist at church does, or it's the guilt trip that the pastor puts on us. Whereas if we can get over, just live and enjoy Jesus and expect and be looking out and be ready to give an answer when these discussions emerge. Have this Christian mindset that we've been talking about so that you're able to respond. And it strikes me, our people are not warning people of hell because they think that's what you do. And we need to understand that.
Well, I don't do it very well. I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying I do. I'm speaking on hell at GAFCON. We've got this conference for the sort of Orthodox Anglican Southern Hemisphere, called by the Archbishop of Nigeria and Sydney. But you know, but I'm sort of thinking, gosh, are we even articulating this?
I think there are a couple of things there. I think I'd say that we need to completely recapture the biblical emphasis that the gospel is a message about deliverance from the wrath to come. And I think we've actually lost that within evangelicalism. I think that is really what we proclaim. We proclaim the love of God. We proclaim the blessings of the Christian life. We proclaim a psychological wholeness, which is basically a therapeutic prosperity gospel. And I don't think we recognise that the gospel is first and foremost a message of a judgment that is coming and an opportunity to be saved and rescued from it. And going back to talking about stories, I think that we need to remember that the Christian story only makes sense in the light of coming judgment and resurrection. It is an eschatological story. So the Christian message is not come to Jesus and your life will be better. The message is come to Jesus, pick up your cross, be prepared to be condemned by the world and bear the shame of following Christ with the hope of a glorious eternal inheritance. So if we expect blessing now and a good life now by following Christ, well, we've not read our New Testaments, but then we'll distort our story. So the story only makes sense in being those who can enter into the inheritance on the other side of the judgment. So it ought to be at the heart of our proclamation. So I think, Rico, we do need to communicate the message of judgment and the message of hell. And I think you're also right to say this sort of burden that we ought to feel to share that message with others, because we don't want them to face the judgment because we've not told them. But I think actually for us as Christians sharing the gospel, one of the great dangers is most Christians do feel an immense burden of failure because of who they've not spoken to, because of perhaps people haven't responded. The Bible isn't calling people to spend every minute of every day warning people around them of the coming of judgment and hell. So I think we have to have a confident trust in God that if we take the opportunities that are given and we speak honestly and truthfully about what the gospel is, God will accomplish his purpose through doing that. And I personally, I'm an unashamed Calvinist. I believe in the sovereignty of God. And I think having a proper understanding of the sovereignty of God, but human responsibility alongside it, is crucial to being an evangelist who maintains psychological balance. Yeah. Because we do have a responsibility to speak, but in the end, salvation is not down to us. And I take it from what the Bible says that not one person will be lost from God's salvation because of our failure. That God will save his people, and that God will have a means of doing that because he's planned it. And I find that Paul's teaching in Romans 9 to 11, therefore, is absolutely crucial. Paul there is explaining how many of the Jews he's spoken to have not believed. And he feels the pain of that immensely. He almost wishes he could be cursed rather than them. But he also recognises God is absolutely sovereign. Yeah. And in a real sense, he's not failed. And I think Christians fall into two mistakes when they think about the sovereignty of God. One is to think that if God is sovereign, I don't need to do anything. But that's not what Paul concludes. Paul's conclusion in Romans 9 to 11 is, I'm going to pray passionately and preach passionately. He's going to take every opportunity he can to share the good news of the gospel. But at the same time, he knows that ultimately the responsibility is not his, that God has his sovereign ways. And I think if our Christian people could hold both of those together, a passionate desire to be praying and sharing the gospel, coupled with a confidence that God is sovereign and he will accomplish his purposes, that to my mind gives us a freedom and a liberation to be able to engage in the work of the gospel without being psychologically crushed.
How do you know which one of those two you're sort of, because I think Don Carson in that chapter 9 of Spiritual Reformation, it's an amazing chapter when he says, I almost stopped praying. There he was writing his PhD on this contrast or this paradox. How do you think you know which one you're falling into, sort of?
Well, I would say in the Christian life, you're probably always falling into one of them more than the other. Yeah. I would say it's a little bit more like a pinball machine in which we kind of tend to bounce between both sides. But the key is never to fall into the hole. And what we have to do is we have to just keep self-correcting. Yeah. So actually, at most points, I will be over towards one extreme rather than the other. And at that point, I need to realise it and recorrect. So I may need to recover the passion for praying and preaching, or I may have to recover the confidence in God's sovereignty. Yes. So I think a right self-reflection helps you to be able to do that.
And I think Paul's experience in Athens is massively helpful in that context. It begins with Paul, it talks about him being in paroxysm. He was deeply distressed when he saw the idolatry. Then we have Luke giving us one of the glorious accounts of evangelistic work. He dialogued in the Agora with the so quaint little philosophers there, and then he went to the Areopagus and presented, and no doubt we have it, it's short form, we have it, but he presented one of the great gospel sermons, which was bold, which was clear. And how did it finish? Most of them just said, we're not interested. There were one or two conversions, and I think we hold that together, don't we? We do all that we can.